The kitchen window caught the late afternoon sun just so, casting long golden rectangles across the worn linoleum floor. Steam rose from the cast-iron pot on the stove, carrying with it the rich scent of beef that had been simmering since morning. In the corner, the old Westinghouse refrigerator hummed its familiar tune, while somewhere upstairs, the sound of Sunday shoes clicked against hardwood floors. It was 3:30 on a Sunday afternoon in small-town Canada, and the ritual was about to begin. Margaret wiped her hands on the tea towel that had hung by the sink for longer than anyone could remember. The pattern, tiny blue roses on white cotton, had faded from countless washings, but it was as much a part of this kitchen as the wooden spoon rack her husband had built 40 years ago. She glanced at the table, already set with the good china that came out every Sunday without fail. 6 places today. Sometimes it was 8, sometimes 4, but the chairs were always arranged in the same careful pattern, each family member in their understood spot. From the living room came the gentle murmur of voices. Her husband Harold was likely settled in his chair, reading snippets from the weekend paper to whoever would listen. Their daughter Susan would be helping the children out of their church clothes upstairs, while Tom, her son-in-law, probably stood by the window, hands in his pockets, watching the neighbor's cat prowl through their vegetable garden. This was Sunday supper, and it had been the same for as long as Margaret could remember, not just in her own home but in the homes of her childhood, her mother's childhood, and likely her grandmother's before that. It was a tradition that required no explanation, no planning committees or written invitations. It simply was, as natural and expected as the church bells that had chimed at 11 that morning. The potatoes were ready now, their skins bursting slightly from the heat. Margaret drained them carefully, the steam fogging her glasses momentarily. She had made this meal hundreds of times, maybe thousands, and yet each Sunday felt both familiar and somehow special. Perhaps it was the way the light fell differently as the seasons changed, or how the faces around her table had evolved over the years. Children growing taller, hair growing grayer, new voices joining the conversation. "Supper's nearly ready," she called, though she knew they would hear the specific sounds that announced the meal was approaching. The clatter of the pot being moved from stove to counter, the careful placement of serving spoons, the gentle tinkle of ice being added to the water glasses. Harold appeared first, as he always did, drawn by some internal clock that had been set decades ago. He moved slowly these days, favoring his right leg where an old farm accident had left its mark, but his eyes still carried that spark of anticipation that came with gathering around the family table. "Smells like heaven in here," he said, settling into his chair at the head of the table. It was the same comment he made every Sunday, delivered with the same gentle smile, and Margaret felt the familiar warmth that came with such predictable affection. Soon the others followed. Susan appeared with 8-year-old Jennifer and 6-year-old Paul, both freshly scrubbed and dressed in their Sunday best. Jennifer's hair was pulled back with a ribbon that matched her dress, while Paul tugged at his tie with the restless energy of a boy who had been sitting still in church for what felt like hours. Tom joined them, sliding into his chair with the comfortable ease of someone who had been part of this family for nearly a decade. He had learned the rhythms of these Sunday gatherings, understood that conversation would flow at its own pace, that stories would emerge naturally between the passing of dishes and the refilling of glasses. Margaret brought the roast to the table, placing it carefully on the trivet that had been her wedding gift from Harold's mother. The meat was perfectly browned, carved into generous slices that would feed this gathering with some left over for cold sandwiches tomorrow. Around it she arranged the bowls and platters that told the story of this meal: mashed potatoes whipped with butter and cream, carrots glazed with honey from their own beehives, green beans from the garden that had been picked just this morning. Harold began carving, his movements deliberate and practiced. This was his role, his contribution to the ritual, and he approached it with the same care he had once brought to his work at the grain elevator. Each slice was precisely cut, each portion thoughtfully distributed according to appetite and preference. "Jennifer, you'll want the outside piece," he said, placing the slightly crisped edge of the roast on her plate. She had always preferred it that way, ever since she was old enough to express an opinion about her food. As the plates filled and were passed around the table, conversation began to flow in the gentle, unhurried way that marked these Sunday gatherings. It wasn't the quick, efficient exchange of information that characterized weekday meals. This was different, deeper, more meandering, like a slow river that had all the time in the world to reach its destination. Paul announced that he had lost another tooth during the week, displaying the gap with pride. This led to a discussion about the tooth fairy's most recent visit, which somehow evolved into Harold's story about losing his first tooth when he was about Paul's age. He had been playing in the barn when it happened, he recalled, and his mother had wrapped the tiny tooth in one of her good handkerchiefs before placing it under his pillow. "Did the tooth fairy come?" Jennifer asked, leaning forward with interest. "Oh, she came all right," Harold said with a wink. "Left me a whole nickel. That was quite something in those days, enough to buy a candy bar with money left over." Margaret smiled as she listened. This story, like so many others that emerged during these Sunday suppers, had been told before. She could probably recite it word for word herself, but that didn't matter. The children were hearing it for the first time, or the second, or the third, and each telling added another layer to their understanding of where they came from, who their family was. Susan asked her mother about the recipe for the carrots, though she had asked the same question many times before. Margaret patiently explained about the honey and the touch of butter, the careful timing that kept them tender but not soft. It wasn't really about the recipe, they both knew. It was about the connection, the passing down of knowledge that couldn't be found in any cookbook. "My mother used to make them the same way," Margaret said, though she grew her own honey too. "Had 3 hives behind the house. I remember helping her harvest the combs when I was younger than Jennifer here." This led to questions about the old farm, about life before electricity and running water, about the rhythms of a world that seemed impossibly distant from their current lives. Margaret found herself describing the way they had preserved food for winter, how her mother had managed to feed a family of 7 from their garden, and a few chickens and a cow. "We had everything we needed," she said, "and we never felt like we were doing without." Different times, I suppose. Tom, who had grown up in the city, listened to these stories with fascination. His own childhood had been comfortable but different. Smaller families, different traditions, different rhythms. He had learned to appreciate the depth of history that surrounded his children at this table, the sense of continuity that connected them to generations of faces they would never meet but whose influence they carried in their blood and bones. As the main course gave way to dessert, Margaret's famous apple pie, made with fruit from their own trees, the conversation took on an even more relaxed quality. Harold leaned back in his chair, completely at ease, while the children took turns describing their week at school, their friends, their small triumphs and disappointments. Jennifer had been chosen to be in the school Christmas pageant, a honor that required much discussion about costumes and lines to memorize. Paul had finally mastered the multiplication tables that had been giving him trouble, earning praise from his grandmother that made his chest swell with pride. These weren't earth-shaking announcements, but they were the substance of family life, the small moments that would be remembered long after the details of world events had faded. Around this table, a child's achievement in arithmetic was as worthy of celebration as any headline in the morning paper. Margaret served generous slices of pie, each one topped with a dollop of cream that had been whipped by hand in the blue ceramic bowl that had belonged to her own grandmother. The apples were perfectly tender, sweetened with just the right amount of sugar and cinnamon, wrapped in a crust that was golden and flaky. "Nobody makes pie like Mum," Susan said, a comment that earned a satisfied smile from Margaret. It was true, though not because Margaret possessed some mysterious culinary gift. It was because she had been making this same pie for 30 years, perfecting the technique through countless Sunday dinners, learning exactly how her oven behaved, exactly how long to let the filling bubble before removing it from heat. As they ate dessert, the afternoon light began to change, growing softer and more golden as it slanted through the kitchen windows. Outside, the maple tree that Harold had planted when Susan was born cast dancing shadows across the yard. In the distance, church bells chimed 4 o'clock, marking another milestone in the gentle progression of this Sunday afternoon. Harold pushed back from the table with a contented sigh. "Fine meal, Maggie," he said, using the nickname he had called her since they were teenagers. Fine meal indeed. The children asked to be excused, disappearing into the backyard where they would play until the light began to fade. Their voices could be heard through the open window, mixing with the chirping of birds and the distant sound of other families enjoying their own Sunday afternoons. Tom and Harold moved to the living room, where they would settle into comfortable chairs and discuss the weather, the prospects for this year's harvest, the state of the hockey team. Their conversation would be unhurried, punctuated by comfortable silences, and the occasional comment from whoever happened to be passing through the room. In the kitchen, Margaret and Susan began the familiar routine of clearing the table and washing the dishes. This too was part of the ritual, the gentle transition from feast to cleanup, from celebration to the practical matters of daily life. They worked together without much conversation, their movements synchronized by years of shared experience. "The children are getting so big," Susan observed, wrapping the leftover roast in wax paper. "Paul's almost as tall as Jennifer now." Margaret nodded, drying the good plates with extra care before returning them to the china cabinet. "Time goes by so fast," she said. "Seems like just yesterday you were their age, helping me set the table for Sunday supper." It was a conversation they had had before, would have again, the kind of gentle reflection that marked the passage of time in small, meaningful increments. They both understood that these Sunday gatherings would not last forever, that children would grow up and move away, that circumstances would change. But for now, in this moment, everything was exactly as it should be. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the kitchen floor, the family gradually drifted back together. The children came in from outside, grass-stained and happy, ready for the quiet activities that would fill the evening hours. Harold emerged from his chair, ready to help with whatever needed doing. Tom appeared in the doorway, comfortable and relaxed in a way that only comes from feeling completely at home. They would spend the evening together, reading, playing quiet games, listening to the radio. There would be light conversation, gentle laughter, the comfortable silences of people who knew each other well. Eventually the children would be tucked into their beds, the adults would share a final cup of tea, and another Sunday would draw to its peaceful close. But the real magic of the day had happened here, around this table, during these few hours when 3 generations had come together to share more than just a meal. They had shared stories, and laughter, traditions, and memories. They had reinforced the bonds that held them together as a family, creating new memories, even as they honored old ones. In the weeks to come, when challenges arose or difficult decisions needed to be made, they would draw strength from these moments of connection. The children would carry forward the stories they had heard, the sense of belonging they had felt, the knowledge that they were part of something larger and more enduring than themselves. This was the true gift of Sunday supper, not just the delicious food or the comfortable surroundings, but the deep sense of continuity it provided, the feeling that some things in life remain constant and reliable even as the world changes around them. In a time when families were beginning to scatter and traditions were starting to fade, these weekly gatherings served as an anchor, a reminder of what really mattered. As Margaret turned off the kitchen light and followed her family into the living room, she felt the deep satisfaction that comes from a day well spent, a tradition properly maintained. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and responsibilities, but tonight all was well. Her family was safe and happy, gathered under her roof, connected to each other and to the generations that had come before them. The kitchen stood empty now, but it held within its walls the echoes of countless conversations, the memory of thousands of meals shared in love and laughter. Come next Sunday, it would fill again with the same gentle chaos, the same familiar rhythms, the same deep sense of belonging that had been nurtured here for decades. This was the legacy of Sunday supper, not just a meal, but a promise kept, a tradition maintained, a family bond strengthened one gathering at a time.